Oh, hello, Caroline.
Hello,
Welcome.
Luke. Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you. Sorry
Nice
to be a bit last minute.
Oh, no trouble at all. No trouble at all. People are still filing in,
Right,
and Sara isn't here quite yet either. Who I'm sure you know very well, looking at your crossover interests here, and would be connected on the same research project.
Sorry?
Have you been connected on the same research as well? Or?
No. So we are working under different research projects, but connected as a result of the obvious overlaps in connections. So yeah,
exactly. Hurry, in terms of what's the quorum for getting going? 14, 15?
Yes, please. No, 14, please.
Okay, super. My name's Luke Heslop. I'm a senior lecturer at Brunel in anthropology, and one of the directors at the Policy Research Institute for South Asia. And I've got the honour and privilege of welcoming two esteemed scholars today on migration studies and education. And so I'm not going to waste too much time, because we're going to have, I think, Caroline speaking first for 15 minutes, followed by Sara, and then we're going to have, in theory, 30 minutes or so for Q&A, and see how that goes. So first up, I just keep admitting people as they turn up. We have Professor Caroline Oliver, who's a professor of sociology at the UCL's Institute of Education, wonderful establishment with a newly refurbished barn. And she's working in practice and society as well, co-director of UCL's Migration Research Unit and the Centre for Sociology of Education and Equity. So we're very lucky to have 15 minutes of Caroline's time today. Likewise, the time of Professor Sara de Jong, who is in the Department of Politics and IR at the University of York, where the sunshine is streaming in, and is the co-chair of the University of York Migration Network, which I think is the capacity in which we're going to be spoken to today on the themes. So I'll not take up too much time and hand straight over to Caroline for presentation number one. Thank you, Caroline. I'll turn my camera and mic off, I think, to save the bandwidth. So over to you, Caroline, when you're ready. Thank you.
I'm just trying to share it, which was simple a minute ago, but now under pressure. Right, here we go. Okay, can you see my starting slide? Okay, thank you. Perfect. Thank you for bearing with me there. And also, I'm very grateful to PRISA for having me along today. As Luke said, I'm Caroline Oliver. And I've been working on this project around Afghan resettlement and relocation for the last couple of years. It's been a very chaotic and intensive time as per the schemes themselves. Just to say that I am working as I'm PI of a broader team. There are a lot of us working on this. So I'm speaking on behalf of those named on that slide. So the research that I'm talking about today has been funded by the Nuffield Foundation, and basically it aimed to look at the two schemes running, ARAP and ACRS, for supporting those who were arriving in the UK following the evacuation of Kabul in 2021. And of course, since that time, there have been quite a few changes in the revelation of the covert scheme as well. So obviously lots has changed. My research background is looking at experiences of urban and national reception of migrants. And so I was very drawn to these schemes for their kind of unique nature, as I'll explain as we go on. just to put those schemes into context, that they ACRS is part of a broader set of safe and legal routes. Of course, we've got others that include the Ukraine schemes, the visas for British national overseas Hong Kongers, and of course refugee family reunion, which has come under scrutiny and pausing and closure of that option. And ARAP sits kind of outside of this as its own separate relocation scheme. But I think just putting that into context, this is from the government, and the resettlement and relocation figures are included in blue. So you can actually see that in terms of the grand scheme of things, that the Afghan resettlement, of which the blue is only part, only comprises part, or Afghans comprise only part of those, is actually fairly small numbers, but does attract perhaps disproportionate attention. Now, our research was looking at how Afghans arriving under those routes are faring once they're in settled accommodation. So initially they were placed in hotels or military estates, before then being moved on into settled accommodation in local communities. And our interest is in the intersection of, well, does it matter where they're placed, and does it matter who they are, and how that affects their abilities to get on. We're also interested in their longer term plans and outcomes, but also have been doing research around resettlement among stakeholders who are working often around Ukrainians and Hong Kongers as well, and may have experience of Syrian resettlement and others under UKRS. Now, our research has been mixed methods, so we've been doing quantitative research, including a survey across 5 regions, aiming to elicit responses from a kind of known target of resettled Afghans in those particular areas. And we worked with a team of 20 Afghan peer researchers that we recruited and trained to administer face-to-face surveys. Excuse me, I've got a terribly heavy cold, so just snipping away. The other part has been participatory research with around 150 people or more, because we're still just finalising the research, but that involved looking at the experiences of Afghan women, Afghan young people, Afghan men, and then lots of stakeholders, as I say, who are responsible. So going from local authority resettlement teams and caseworkers through to commission services to migrant community organisations, and including national agencies and departments, including the Ministry of Defence. We also had regional roundtables to feed back some of our findings and sort of see how that sat with many other council resettlement teams. I would say it's still quite early days in the sense that we have quite a lot of insight into what each stream of research shows, but actually we're starting now to synthesize that data and bring that together. Before I go into some of those emerging findings, I do just want to stress something about the context and background of the schemes, because obviously in some ways these are quite unique schemes. In the field of migration studies, they're known as kind of bespoke humanitarian routes that were kind of developed in response to a particular emergency situation that was going on, that might have obviously been predicted, but nevertheless was developing kind of at the moment from 2021 under Operation Pitting, and then under Operation Lazarite, overseen by the Ministry of Defence. There were quite a lot of criticisms around the schemes and processes, operational issues. But in some ways, there's also something quite sort of interesting in the sense that this was a resettlement process that that most local authorities across the country were expected to step up to, and they were also quite well funded to do so, receiving funds per individual, but also opportunities for housing support and top up in various ways. Again, quite unique in the sense that the plan was for them to move quite quickly into settled accommodation, but that often took much longer. So some of our families that we spoke to were in hotels for up to 18 months, with obvious impacts in terms of sort of impacts on education and ability to move on independently. As Sarah will talk about, the schemes were operating under this kind of super injunction on the press, and knowledge of the covert resettlement scheme that became public following the data breach revelations. The application for the Afghan resettlement programme closed in July this year, but those that were already accepted were still arriving, although again this is something that is rather shrouded in mystery, as the flights have been paused, and the use of the military estate is being drawn down, and families are expected to leave by the end of November. So the findings that we can share so far, looking at across the survey and across our qualitative research, is that what do we actually know about the Afghans who are resettled here? So the Afghans are working age, generally living with families, often quite large families with children, and overwhelmingly across our streams of research, they felt a sense of safety and huge gratitude to the UK government, and that came across from the women, it came across from the men, it came across from the young people as well. And there's some examples there of quotes from some of the people that we talked to about what a difference it makes that they can sleep peacefully, and now they know how life can be without having that constant threat over their heads. At the same time, it was striking about how much their lives have changed immensely, for some more than others, but particularly for the young people, a real sense of kind of visceral culture shock or resettlement shock. But particularly for the young people, that was associated with a kind of nervous excitement of all these sort of strange and weird things, and a real sense of embracing opportunities. And Rayhan there talks about, the opportunity for education that's tied up with these feelings of safety and gratitude for their lives. At the same time, it's not to say that there aren't intense pressures that come with resettlement, on as well as the culture shock and the adjustments that families and young people are having to do. There are many families are facing financial precarity. Benefit systems in the UK are set up for two parents working, so some of the families, particularly the large families, are struggling to make ends meet. So in terms of where they're placed around the country, being able to shop in cheaper shops, so Aldi or Lidl's, is really important, as well as being close to proximity to cultural resources and halal shops, in order to be able to feed their families in ways that they would like. Our survey also showed that many are really struggling. So although there's this overwhelming feeling of safety and gratitude and that kind of ontological security, in terms of social connections and having practical support networks, that is for probably about a third of our participants, that is an area of real concern, that many aren't connected, particularly locally, and also struggling with poor mental well-being, and that's also associated, of course, with family separation. And although obviously in the previous slide I was talking about the fact that there's a lot of excitement about the future for the young people, that actually there was also evidence of quite a lot of mental health pressures for the young people, because of the fact that they are on one hand recipients of kind of intense family expectations. So for many of the parents, they talked about the fact that their lives may not develop in the ways that they would like, but their children's lives will. So this is putting expectations on the families, but also a huge amount of practical contributions to support parents who may be struggling themselves with mental health or physical health needs, and also many families who are struggling with English. And an example I have here is from Ahmed, who talks about how his father was experiencing terminal illness, but the sense that he shouldn't speak to other people, other Afghans, because he had to keep that private amongst his own family. But at the same time as managing that burden, he also felt this responsibility to look after his siblings and keep everyone's mood up. He also had to help with meetings. The family was split between two houses because of the size of the family. And so he kind of stepped up as at the time as being sort of 18, but having to manage, things like meetings with the council, paying the bills, universal credit applications. So managing the house, managing ill health of parents, and also keeping everyone's mood up, as well as performing incredibly hard at school, doing meeting needs. He struggled to pass his English GCSE, but then moved into A levels and was actually thriving there. Then the issue around employment, and for the parents, particularly obviously the men, as is common often with refugee employment, evidence of de-skilling, and examples there of a Secret Service officer now lifting boxes, somebody working as a judge, but actually now going to be a delivery driver. But also one of the things that emerges about this, the slow pace that they felt, was the English classes, and they felt a real frustration between being able, on one hand, to being able to work at their level, and actually not feeling the support because of the slow pace of classes and gaps in between. And then at the same time as balancing employment, there was a lot of, we need to do more research around this, the shifting roles that were occurring in families because of the fact that often the wives weren't speaking English, so they're having to look after all the school issues, often children being in different schools around a locality, and having to manage the logistics of that with working lives as well. That's it for the minute. We have a lot more work to do in terms of synthesizing the research. We plan to bring this together into a final report for the funders for the Nuffield Foundation, as well as launching policy and practice briefs to local authorities. And we would, of course, like to engage in further work with the Afghans that we worked with, to share the results and think about some of the solutions to some of the issues that we've emerged. Thank you for bearing with me, and my cold, my thoughts are a little fuzzy at the moment, but I hope that's helpful to give an insight into the work that we've been doing. And please do reach out to me to receive a copy of the final report. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. That was fantastic. Really, really interesting and lots to kind of digest. I think because we'll do all the questions at the end, I'll just pass straight on over now to Sara.
Right. I'm gonna face the same challenge as Caroline. Let me see if this works. Can you see this now?
Very small.
Very small. Interesting.
It's still, yeah, it's come up in the similar. We can see the slides on the left, but it hasn't yet filled the.
Right. I think it might be because I'm working across 2 different screens. Not quite sure how to resolve this. Is this any better or not?
No, that's kind of worse.
The same.
It's gone in a very strange. You could email it to me, and then you will do this kind of thing where you say next slide, please, and I'll click it along for you.
Right. Okay, let's do that. Do I have your email address?
Just put it into the chat.
Right. Okay, I've sent it to you now.
Okay, super. I'm sure it'll come through. If you want to,
I'm
get
happy
started,
to just start. Exactly. Yeah.
I'll just put it up.
Let me just introduce myself first in slightly more detail because as Luc has already said, I'm an academic and I'm a professor of politics at the University of York. But I've also been engaged with this as part of the Sulha Alliance, which is a charity that advocates for and supports Afghan interpreters that supported the British Army. And so my research on this started about 8 years ago, so before August 2021, when I was interested in how Afghans Afghans who had worked for Western forces were seeking protection and rights from the countries they worked for. So my research was not just focused on the UK, but also looked comparatively at how other countries such as the Netherlands, Germany, France, who also had Afghan employees, were addressing their safety concerns as well as their resettlement. So I'm also the chair of the Sulha Alliance, and I'm speaking partially also from that work where, as part of a charity, I'm in daily contact with Afghans, including those who were affected by the data breach. I'm hoping Luc can share my slides soon. Have you received them, Luc?
It's still not come through on my Outlook. I've refreshed it. Yeah, it's come. It's just arrived now.
Perfect.
So it'll be up in no time.
Yeah, so most people, I suppose, became aware of the so-called Afghan data breach in July 2025, when the Minister of Defense announced in the House of Parliament that there had been a major data breach, which meant that the details of 18,700 principal applicants had been compromised. And you may recall that he mentioned that this compromising of the data had actually already happened a longer time ago. I'm hoping exactly that Luc puts on my slides. If you could go to the next one. Yes. So there was a major data breach that, as I said, we became aware of in July 2025 when it was officially communicated in the House of Parliament. But it's important to know that this major data breach actually happened in February 2022, and that the MOD itself became aware that this has happened in August 2023. I also have referred to this as the major data breach, just to put this in a context, because it has been revealed after this data breach, the major data breach information came out, that over the past 4 years, Arab and DAR, the unit that handles the relocation applications from Afghans seeking safety in the UK, had in fact had 49 separate data breaches, and 4 of those had already been known to the public, but those other 45 had not been made public yet. So as I said, the personal information linked to around 18,700 applicants of the Afghan Relocation and Assistance Program that Caroline has spoken about were revealed, and also those of another scheme, the ex gratia scheme, which was a scheme primarily aimed actually at Afghan interpreters rather than other Afghans, Afghan interpreters who had worked for the British Army. And that ex gratia scheme already existed long before 2021. And it was a scheme specifically for people who had worked as an interpreter on patrol with British Army soldiers. And so they were always already exposed to lots of risks. And this scheme allowed people who had worked for more than 12 months outside of the wire, so in patrol roles, to come to the UK. So the data that was leaked refers to applications made on or before the 7th of January 2022. When the MOD became aware of the leak in August 2023, that was actually also the same time that I personally became aware of the data breach. I suppose because I'm working in this context, I'm in contact with a lot of Afghans, I'm in contact with a lot of stakeholders and experts in this field. Of course, there were some people who became aware, and at that point, there was also a journalist who became aware. And when the MOD became aware that there were others who had simultaneously become aware, they decided to go to court and ask for what is called a super injunction, which meant that people weren't able to communicate that they were aware of this data breach, and they were also not allowed to communicate about the fact that there was a super injunction. So not only could we not talk, but we could also not talk about the fact that we couldn't talk, if that makes sense. So yes, I myself was aware of this data breach about 22 months before it was finally officially communicated, and have been discreet with that information, of course, as a result of that super injunction. So I've just put on the right side of the slide a picture just to give people a better understanding of what it meant from an Afghan perspective to be subjected to this data breach. So most Afghans who were affected weren't told about the fact that their data had been breached until July 2025. So I think it was a Wednesday that the minister spoke in Parliament, maybe Tuesday, and just a few hours before, and also in the hours that followed, Afghans whose data had been breached were receiving an email in which they were told that their data was likely compromised. And they also received a link to what was called a self-checker, and they could insert in that link, input in that link, their kind of reference number for their application. And if their data was compromised, this kind of red message came up that you see on the right-hand side. So it just explains, our records indicate that personal data from the reference number you supplied is likely to be affected by the data incident. And I think, again, here it's meaningful to say that I'm part of the Sulh Alliance, and as part of this, our charity runs 2 WhatsApp groups that provide support for Afghan interpreters who have now been resettled to the UK, where they can exchange information, ask questions to our team, help each other. And what you can probably imagine is that on that date in July 2025, we had lots of people who started sharing that they had received this email from the MOD and that they had received the red self-checker. Next slide, please. Yeah, great. As you can see in the self-checker, what's really interesting is that the Ministry of Defense had not only waited for a very long time to communicate to people that their data was compromised, but also once they were informing individuals that their data may have been compromised, they were not giving any exact information about what type of individual information may be compromised. Now, just, I really want to get away from just thinking about this in abstract terms. So what you have to imagine is that an Afghan who has worked for the British Army or for British organizations would have applied to be resettled under the Afghan Relocation and Assistance Program or under ex gratia. And as part of that exchange, they would have uploaded various types of information about their employment history. They would also have mentioned the dates of birth and the names and details, relationship details of family members. Because under the schemes, normally what happens is that principal applicants, so the person who has worked for the British Army or for other UK government institutions, can bring family members who are under 18, dependents, children, and their wife or husband with them. And if they have very good reasons, this is in exceptional circumstances, to bring additional family members. So that could be a father or mother, for instance, if they would be medically dependent on the person and therefore not able to be left behind in Afghanistan if the principal applicant would be brought to the UK, they would also be able to perhaps bring this person. So as part of this data gathering, when people apply, they would also maybe say, please also bring my mother, because my mother is very seriously ill and dependent on my care, or my brother is disabled and living with me. And they would have also included the information of that individual. It could, of course, be that then the mother, the father, or the brother would have been brought to the UK, but it can also have been that the Arab team would have decided to only bring the principal applicant, children and spouse, and that the other family member about whom there was communication would still currently be in Afghanistan because their application was rejected. So what you can imagine from the perspective of affected Afghans is that many of them, having only been informed about this, years after their data was compromised, they started thinking back about everything they would have shared with the responsible unit for the relocation. And they would have started doubting what exact information of them would have been leaked. Was it just a name? Was it also their family? You could see in the self-checker that there is a warning from the MOD that family information could also have been compromised. And then, as you could see in the self-checker, the Ministry of Defense provided security advice, which you can also find still on the Ministry of Defense website. And that security advice looks as follows. You can see that the Ministry of Defense advised people to be vigilant about phone calls from unknown numbers, to be vigilant about social media profiles, to consider using a virtual private network rather than direct access to the internet. And then it says also that family members could be affected and therefore, of course, should apply the same security advice. And then in the final paragraph on the slide, you can see that they are advising that if any person who was informed that their data was breached is still outside of the UK, they should not travel to a third country without a valid passport and visa, as that would put them at further risk, as they could be deported back to Afghanistan, for example, from Pakistan. It also says that the MOD was not able to provide support in a third country, such as Pakistan, unless people had already been invited to resettle to the UK. You can imagine that this security advice raised lots of questions to Afghans who were affected by the data breach. The first question was about how to apply this security advice if people could only apply that from the moment they were aware that their data was breached. So for instance, if the MOD tells us that it is important that social media profiles are hidden, of course, people can't travel back in time and retrospectively change their Facebook account or their Twitter account or Instagram account. There's also, of course, restrictions in terms of what people can do in Afghanistan, as you can see here. While people in the UK may feel that they're able to take some of these security measures, if you're in Pakistan or in Afghanistan, you may need further support, but you may not be able to. As is explained here, you wouldn't get that. As Caroline has already explained, there was an Afghan response route set up by the Ministry of Defense for a small group of Afghans who was affected by the data breach. So this is really only a fraction of it. It's really important to notice. So as I said, 18,700 principal applicants were on the list and their data was breached. When the Ministry of Defense looked back at that list, they realized that there were a group of people who would have been eligible to ARAP in the first place, and they reviewed their applications and they have now resettled them under the normal Afghan relocation and assistance program. So that was, I think, about 3,000 something principal applicants. And they also decided that there were 1,531 principal applicants who wouldn't normally have been eligible, but they judged that they would now be at risk because of their data being compromised, and they have brought those people together with family members to the UK. But we don't know, and there's no information yet publicly available, how the government has made those decisions about who was selected for the Afghan response route and who was not selected for the Afghan response route. So until now, a certain the number that is known is that about 27,000 people in total have been resettled, who were kind of linked to that list that was breached. But that is including the family members. And those of you who are familiar with Afghan culture will know that most family units will be 4 or 5 family members at least. And so if you would look at 18,700 principal applicants times 4 or 5, we're looking at about 74,000 people who have potentially been affected. And the people who have been brought to the UK are only a small number of those. What was also important to know about the security advice, the communication by the MOD, that while they gave security advice and a self-checker, there was no designated contact point to raise questions or concerns. So there was no email address to say, if you have any concerns or questions, please contact us here. Next slide, please. So what are the impacts of the data breach then for individuals concerned? It is very difficult to speak about this in general terms. Like Caroline, I have some research that is ongoing that I can't quite present here yet. It's collaborative research with an academic colleague and a charity, where we have done a survey among affected Afghans and asked them to report what the impact has been. And I think it will be really important to foreground their voices and to hear from themselves how they describe the effects. And the effects, of course, as you can imagine, may fall down in at least 2 different categories. One is, what are the kind of Taliban security threats that people think are a result of the data breach? And secondly, what kind of psychological and physical impact has the awareness of the data breach had on people who have been affected? But as I said, I think it's really important to say that we can't generalize the impact, because of course there's a different impact on those Afghans who have already been resettled to the UK versus those Afghans who are currently in Afghanistan or in third countries such as Iran or Pakistan. And again, that last group also breaks down in people who have already been promised resettlement, so who are maybe not feeling fully secure at the moment, but who have a kind of promise of future security, versus those who have not received an offer for resettlement, even though they know that their data was affected. There might also be differences between, in terms of how sensitive the information was that people have shared with the team that is responsible, with the unit that is responsible for the resettlement. So have you, for instance, as I said in my previous example, shared the details of your disabled brother, and has he then been rejected for relocation, then you would potentially be more worried. But also depending on your role, you may have the feeling that people or the Taliban already knew anyways about who you were and what you had done, or you feel that the data breach has really exacerbated your situation. So as you may know, the government commissioned a former civil servant, Paul Rimmer, to write a report on the impact of the data breach. And in his report, he claims that the Taliban already have access to significant volumes of data, which enables them to identify personnel associated with the former government. But the Afghan Relocation and Assistance Program, as Caroline already mentioned, provided relocation for a broad group of Afghans, some of whom were indeed linked to the former Afghan government, but many of whom were not linked to the former Afghan government, but who were working as civilian interpreters, for instance, for the British Army. So they could still feel that the data breach has really put very new information to the Taliban. there have also been Afghans who reported to us that they have been quite unhappy about all the media exposure the data breach got, because they were very worried that even if the list wouldn't have been in the hands of the Taliban so far, of course, making the Taliban aware of the value of the list would actually put them at increased risk. As I said, then you have principal applicants versus family who will be differentially affected. And I think finally, we need to place this in a broader context of how this information and this news about the data breach impacted people. On the right, you see a picture of some of the interviews with a quote from some of the interviews that I conducted previously with Afghan interpreters. And you can see him say here, "I feel tired, but I cannot sleep, the things I've seen." Afghan interpreters worked in really risky situations for the British Army, were exposed to, of course, a lot of violence for extended period of times. And so many of them already suffer with long-standing security concerns, a loss of trust in several institutions, both UK government and Afghan institutions, including manifestations of PTSD and trauma. And so the news about the data breach has to be contextualized with this longer-standing sense of a loss of security. And then just to finally give some context from the Afghanistan side as well. As many of you know, last week the Taliban briefly shut down the internet first in some provinces of Afghanistan and then in the whole of Afghanistan. And so there have also been geopolitical events happening after the data breach was made public that will make people increasingly aware of the way in which the Taliban is using data and is avoiding the surveillance and protection efforts of other countries. And so that again would have led to a heightening of concern about the data breach. Thank you.
Okay, let me just stop the sharing there. And firstly, let me get my. There we go. Right, that's, I think, the nicer way to. And there's fantastic, really, I mean, mind-blowing presentations. Thank you both for sharing that. I think I'll start off while people get their thoughts together and questions. So we've got kind of a wide range of things. I think just Sara, off your presentation that we've just had there. I mean, it really, this is such a huge, it was a huge story, and catastrophe and calamitous. And I wondered, with your research, and I know that you're doing a lot with the organisations, and you're working off presumably the reports that the ministry put out. Are you doing research interviews, and do you have discussions with the Ministry of Defence as well, or are you working with secondary documents for this?
No, this is thank you for that question, Luke. So as Caroline also knows, the Defence Select Committee has recently put out an inquiry on the data breach and Afghan resettlement. So most of the inquiry focuses on whether the injunction was proportional or not, whether the government took timely action and appropriate action in the wake of the data breach, and then looking at the impact of the data breach also on UK citizens and trust among UK citizens, but of course also among Afghan citizens. And so because I've previously given evidence to the Defence Select Committee immediately after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and also back in, I think, 2018, when they were looking at the resettlement of interpreters specifically, I received an email asked me whether we would be interested in providing evidence again. And so I've teamed up with Refugee Legal Support, a charity, as well as an academic colleague. And for that, we have a very short time frame. The deadline of that call for written evidence is the 14th of October. We have made a survey where we are asking people about the impact of the data breach, and we have received more than 300, I think more than 350 responses. And we are currently analyzing both the quantitative as well as the qualitative data. But just the way the Defense Select Committee works means that you first have to provide them with the data before you can make the other data public. And that's why we haven't made it public, but we're working on a bigger report on that. So that will be, in a sense, in dialogue with the government, because the Select Committee, as you know, has members of parliament from all the different parties.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder, sort of connecting the two papers here, there's a kind of sense of the unknown about the Taliban's operational infrastructure to be able to enact punishment on those whose data has been breached. And I wondered whether there was a crossover in Caroline's work, but thinking about the kind of psychological factors that are kind of impacting people. Like, there's this element of, on the one hand, the kind of accessing services in the UK, the sense of de-skilling, the sort of barring of language, the trauma of things that have happened in the past. But then you have this like next wave of concern. I wondered whether that aspect of your work, Sara, seeped into some of the testimonies and things that your informants had to say, Caroline.
Yeah, I mean, I can add a bit to that, because obviously there was so much positive about that sense of security. There was a sort of immediate relief of being out of Afghanistan. But of course, many of the families are still in direct daily contact with family members back in Afghanistan or Pakistan, and that trauma is very much alive for them. And you know, so the sense, in a way, that the programs offer that security for those people is very partial, and particularly I think that speaks to those who have children who are slightly older, so wouldn't necessarily been counted, but actually are still left behind. So, you know, in their late teens, early 20s, and many of the families are still in contact with those people. So the sense that actually, you know, they're not removed in any way, shape or form from what's going on. And yeah, I think there's definitely a compounding that's going on. We need to explore more into our data, but you know, there's a really curious mix between, you know, on one hand, immediate relief, security, but also these ongoing traumas that as Sarah's paper picked up.
And I think, sorry, Caroline.
No, carry on, please.
No, I'm just thinking that maybe what Caroline and I have failed to mention so far is that the AFM route, additional family route, so where people could apply for additional family members who were either extremely vulnerable or subject to risk because of association with the principal applicant. So let's say the Taliban threatening a brother of an interpreter because the interpreter is now in the UK and therefore kind of targeting him, which in the Afghan context is quite common. That scheme was closed in the way that it existed just a few weeks before this announcement about the data breach was made. And at the same time, also just a few weeks before the announcement of the data breach was made, the Afghan Relocation and Assistance Program, as well as the ACRS, which is the other resettlement program, were also closed. So what happened was that people got this new information and started to think again about things that had happened to them in the past or that had happened to them and their family members, but they couldn't respond by way of applying to kind of safe and legal routes because simultaneously they had just been closed by the government. So I guess from an Afghan perspective, right, that month of July kind of offered a kind of closure and moment of concern on very many different levels.
Definitely. Yeah.
It's you think if they say that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was the death of Euro-American interventionism, and if that wasn't, then certainly the data breach might have sealed the deal in terms of trust building in other countries. I mean,
Yeah, it's very interesting as well about sort of the logic, however, of why that the schemes are still being supported by the Ministry of Defence. It is very much about continuing that logic, in the sense that for the Ministry of Defence, there's a kind of moral imperative to look after those who've stood alongside British forces, but there's also a future aspect that actually they need to be seen to be doing, to be supporting those who've worked with them, and that we have actually done some research in government departments, and that is the logic.
Yeah, and I think really important point by Caroline. I mean, I think for me that was always my entry point for the research. I was not just looking at the Afghan scheme, but also at Iraqi resettlement schemes, and my kind of motivation was that this has a longer precedent, right? We can think of Vietnam, but we can also even think of colonial interventions where imperial powers were always dependent on having local staff, locally engaged staff, whether informally as interpreters or whether more formally. And that kind of position of then being seen as a kind of traitor translator is something that goes back literally to people like Pocahontas or La Malinche in the Mexican context, where the Spanish conquistadors needed her as an interpreter. And I think, my expectation is also that it will happen again in the future. And so on my slide, my first slide, you may have seen also the logo of LSI, which stands for Local Staff International, which is a new international NGO that we have founded that looks at the protection of locally employed staff more broadly, because they often fall between the cracks of international humanitarian law, kind of refugee law, immigration law, and employment law, even though this is a very essential group of people whose work is absolutely indispensable, and the MOD recognizes that. But what we see is that their lives sometimes may look like they're expendable. And I think that tension between their indispensable work, but the expendability of their lives is something that I kind of more broadly feel we need to address.
Yeah, can you share a link in the chat for the organization for LSI?
Yeah, I will.
That'd be great. And Huri's got a question. Caroline, I have more questions to ask you about food and eateries as well, for your population. But Huri, please jump in.
Hello again. Sorry I cut you off. Look, it was just like I have massive questions. Thank you so much to both of you for sharing all of your hard work. They are really amazing, and it opened up a new window that I'm still seeking in and understanding it. But there were a couple of ideas that you came across. First of all, this is really scary, the MOD. It's leaked out. Have they done any management system? I do understand that they understand what is so sensitive, but how they're going to take action for the future and how they're going to prevent it. That's something that has scared me. Have they talked about it? Did they take action? But the fact that they didn't talk about it for a long time, was that deliberately, or what was the idea? What is it happening that I don't understand it? For me, UK is home, and seeing that this is happening, it's just very scary for me. And what was their internal view? How they reacted to it? Was there any support that they gave afterwards? It's so like, I don't know, it's just so much shocking for me to understand and see how it goes with this process, because I'm working on Iranian case and they're giving the protection of my participants, but now looking at these bridge, how am I going to trust them? And this might happen for us as well. It's a little bit, because is there any psychology, security support or anything they have done, or anything at all?
No, there's not. Huri, very excellent question. So much to say. I've shared in the chat the report or kind of statement of the Information Commissioner Office, and they report on how there has been an investigation of how this could happen and what measures the MOD has taken, has put in place for an avoidance of this to happen again. So there has been action by the MOD in terms of improving the security of their data. But at the same time, of course, the volume of the data breaches will still mean that many people are concerned. The major action that they took was to set up this secret hidden covert operation, the Afghan response route, to bring a select group of people who had been affected by the data breach out of Afghanistan into the UK. And there's still, as the minister has said, a few people who have been offered relocation under that route who are now waiting to be resettled to the UK. So that's the kind of biggest, and that is a substantial operation that the MOD has committed to. It's a costly operation. The questions that would be raised is more about, as you said, the wider impact of people who may already be in the UK. So resettlement is not what they need, but they may indeed need mental health support, as well as those people who have not been offered relocation. And at the moment, it's not entirely clear how the selection process has been taking place. I don't know, unless Caroline knows more about this, in terms of what triaging has happened in terms of deciding who's more at risk and who is less at risk as a result of the data breach, given that the spreadsheet itself didn't differentiate the data necessarily. Caroline, I'm sure you want to come in as well.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I don't know that. We have been talking with the government departments, but that aspect, like many things, are still shrouded in mystery. So yeah, I can't shed light on that triaging process. But I think it's a really important question, because in general we know that with the schemes that there are those questions around eligibility. And I think also something that's really important to mention, and we haven't mentioned here, is the fact that many other Afghans who, for many reasons, have sought to come via irregular routes. And so there's a much larger proportion of asylum seekers, Afghan asylum seekers, who haven't come in under the resettlement schemes, but to all intents and purposes have the same claims. But I think that's also important to recognize within this, that when we are talking about resettlement, relocation, it is in some ways it is the privileged few, and even the ways in which those are chosen in some ways, there are issues and challenges around who gets chosen and who doesn't.
I think really important point that Caroline made. I mean, when the MOD closed the ARP and ACRS scheme, they had to do a risk assessment, and as part of that risk assessment, they did indicate that small boat arrivals may increase because, of course, the moment you close safe and legal routes, people who are very desperate may move elsewhere. But it was not entirely clear from that very short public risk assessment how they're actually mitigating against that risk. And so I think what Caroline has underlined here is crucial.
It is. Thank you for your answers. And the next question would be, is there anything that we can do? Is it like a trainee that we can teach them to be aware if a leaking happens again, what they have to do? So prepare them for the next leaking, perhaps, or anything that they go through, a danger or a challenge that they're facing.
I mean, I would actually say, but I'm basing myself here primarily on my research with Afghan interpreters who work for the British Army, but they are very aware of their security and the risks anyways. Because even when they worked for the British Army, many of them, of course, were subject to attacks. For instance, when they went on leave, or even when they just entered the base on a daily basis, they were also acutely aware of the risks after their employment. So before 2021, and as I said, many people waited for years before they finally got resettled. While they were working for the British Army in Afghanistan, they also received some security advice, including things such as, don't save certain numbers in your phone with British names, etc., etc. Check your car, don't walk around with the flashy watch. But I would actually say, I mean, I put also a lot of faith in Afghans themselves. I think they are the ones who have the deepest knowledge about the risks that they face. They have the deepest knowledge about the structures of Afghan society. And I think it is important in that light for the MOD to really take seriously and listen to the assessment that Afghans themselves have of their security situation and how their risk could be mitigated, because often we think that we are the experts, but I would really say it's the Afghans who are the experts here.
And I would say also, just to add in there, Sarah, that the research that you're doing to actually generate insight into those impacts is really important. And, you know, I know it was a very nimble piece of work that you've had to do, but I think really important. So thank you for doing that.
Sorry, I agree. Obviously, it's very amazing what they are doing. But I was wondering, what can we offer as PRISA think tank? What do you think that it is there that is needed, and we can help them, but we are not doing it?
I sense this one might be a bigger conversation.
It's a big question, a good question. I mean,
it is.
I appreciate. I appreciate, you know, I think that the question of us taking responsibility is really important. So let me think about this.
Okay. So, Kelly, I will promise that this is the last question, and then I will give the floor to the others as well. I was just wondering, you know, when you were mentioning how finding the food and connecting with the halal meat, or I don't know, even the environment that they're going through, would having pre-cultural sessions help them?
Now, this is a really important question and very interesting, because amongst some of the Afghans that we spoke to, there is this sense that actually they wish that they'd known things before. I mean, I'm quite hesitant as an anthropologist by background about these types of cultural trainings and things like that, because I do think that they can perpetuate stereotypes and there are lots of risks with them. On the other hand, there were definitely one of the big issues in our research that we'll unpack a bit more as we go on, is about the expectations and understandings on both sides of both Afghans, from what they felt that they were told and should be expected of British society, and also the realities that then they faced, but then also on the other hand from support services and the work that they did, and about sort of understanding, you know, the families that they were supporting. And one example of that is that, you know, they many of the local authorities that we were working with were assuming that because many of these people were working with the British, that they would be speaking English and that they would slot in seamlessly. And of course that, you know, the reality is much more complex and checkered. So it's an interesting point. I wouldn't like to say at this point that I would advocate for that kind of I
think it needs education. A research in it, is it?
But I think Caroline is right to emphasize also that awareness needs to come from both sides, if at all, right? I think, I mean, a very, very classical example, I'm sure Caroline, you have heard it and your fellow researchers have heard this, is that I think the Home Office and MOD were making efforts to provide appropriate food in the hotels for Afghan evacuees. And often what they did was they brought in Indian caterers, thinking that this was something that was kind of culturally appropriate. But Afghan food, for those of you who know it, is not very spicy at all, or not spicy, whereas Indian food is very spicy. So it was very common for people who had been evacuated to tell stories of how their children could not eat any of the food, or would only have stomach aches, and how they would, with the very limited resources they have, get some biscuits to desperately feed their children. And then there were some kind of accommodations where there was more openness for bringing in the expertise of Afghans themselves, who then even offered to organize the catering themselves, whereas other places were much more constrained in whether they were willing to do that. And that seemed to be such a simple one, which I've heard time and time again of different locations, which shows that kind of mismatch of expectations and what gets lost in translation when people are not aware of needs.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much, both of you. I really enjoyed it. And
if it's okay, from Otman. Sorry, I just want to.
I just wanted to highlight that can we have the report into the PRISA's email, please? So we would be aware and analyze it. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I'm giving the floor. If it's up to me, I will talk till tomorrow. Thank you again.
Othman, do you want to jump in there? And then this probably has to be our last question, given the time.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to thank you for this valuable insights that you're giving us. It's really valuable, not only for the community of researchers about relocation and migration in Afghanistan, but it's also valuable for other communities working on this topic across the world. I really thank you for this valuable information. So my question is about the data. Like, since those people that are in unstable situation, usually we have data from the past. We spend time analyze it, then we create a report with some recommendations. Those recommendations they're like based on the data of the past, but sometimes we have a changed situation. Like, we're given a recommendation for another situation because we have a data from the past. So what if we introduce some sort of monthly or weekly digital surveys to give us to those people, so we're going to have like more recent data. So when we create reports or when we make recommendation, we give recommendation about the recent situation, not the old situation. And I have another question. It's kind of connected to this question, and also I think it's a bit of summary of the previous questions. How are we going to build trust among those people to be part of this form of surveys and also other form of surveys? And thank you so much.
Such excellent questions. I mean, I think to your first question, I often, because I have my two hats on as an academic and as somebody who is engaged in a charity, I'm frustrated with the slowness of academia. And at the same time, as an academic, I also need to protect that slowness in a sense, because it allows us to have a deeper analysis of data than we could otherwise offer. So I think this is one where I'm really torn. We have tried to be really responsive to the data breach with this short survey that we have now put out. And we're writing up the report so that we can share that with the Defense Select Committee very immediately. But I think you do speak to a wider issue where, even Caroline and I, we had a discussion quite recently about the fact that some of the resettlement arrangements for Afghans have already changed since the collection of some of the data, also including mine, in 2022. And we are not always indeed able to be as responsive as you would want to be. It is important also to say that the government is also collecting its own data and has been collecting its own data, including at the moment there's a Home Office survey on resettlement outcomes that I hope can feed into their practice. And that speaks really also to your final question about trust. And that's a key one. I mean, when I noticed it again when I was putting out the survey, including two interpreters who I know for many years, they sent me private messages asking me indeed how could I keep their data safe. So what we have done with the survey that we have recently put out is that we simply don't ask for personal information. We don't ask people's names. We don't ask people's email addresses, so that they know that they can be safe, simply because we're not asking them to reveal things that could put them at risk. I think that's a real key one. But again, I'm sure, as Caroline is also aware, even for the interpreters that I deal with that are relatively fluent in English, it's sometimes difficult to identify which survey is coming from where, who's asking them something for what reason. So they may, even though they might know me personally and have met me maybe personally, when they then get a survey from the Home Office the next week, it's quite difficult for people to differentiate the different goals, the different institutions who sent them this data. I mean, our universities have very robust kind of ethics committees that make sure that we are not harming people. And I'm sure Caroline has more to say on this.
Yeah, definitely. These are really important questions. And like Sarah, I share the kind of frustration that you know, we would want to be doing that regular catch up and, you know, gaining those more sort of monthly updates, but there is a balance to be struck, because also, you know, people who are just trying to have so much going on in their lives, I mean, really, some of the people that we were working with, it was, you know, it was incredible, and the amount that they're juggling and having to sort of manage. So then to add the burden of research on top of that is also quite difficult. And I mean, the way that we did that was by employing people who were on the schemes themselves, and sort of trying to work in that way to also help you know, provide some people with some skills and experience of employment, at the same time as providing a sort of trusted person within the networks. Often when we were doing the recruitment for who would be involved in our survey work, it was about those who had already been the kind of go-to people in the hotels or whatever, and that were often, you know, the known people. So trying to work through those networks is a way of building trust, but there's also a responsibility on us as academics to make sure that engagement is taken seriously. And often that's even though there's a kind of emphasis from the university around engagement and impact, it's often the poor cousin in terms of actually how much time and resources there are at the end of that. But I think that, you know, that's the way that we can, and, you know, Sarah's a really good example of already doing that by working with the Scylla Alliance outside of an academic, outside of her academic role as well. So and as Sarah said as well, there's the government evaluation itself of its work. I think, you know, just trying to emphasize and draw distinctions to actually say that in some ways academic research offers something of a safe space to say things that, you know, we were working in collaboration with local authority caseworkers as a way of kind of gaining access and knowing our, you know, our sampling frame in an area, but it was also very much about sort of emphasizing the independence of the work that we were doing, because of the fact that, you know, being able to raise concerns and being able to feel like they were going to be taken seriously was really, you know, that's what we also wanted to know about. So I think, you know, there is a role, even as frustrating as it is for slow academic work, to you know, kind of provide other channels that wouldn't otherwise exist, but it's not perfect by any means.
I think that I would like to thank you both for such a fascinating discussion and presentations. It's been a brilliant session, and I think that we need to continue these conversations with PRISA, and maybe in the future have you both over to West London, and we have an in-person meeting. I think Zishan might be cooking something like that up. So I would just like to say thank you on behalf of all of us, and thank you to everybody who's attended and asked questions. And unless there's any other business, I will say have a wonderful afternoon.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, for the questions, and let's continue the conversation indeed.
Likewise. Absolutely. And thanks for your chairing, Luke. Good job.
My pleasure. Honestly, my pleasure. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.